Hello, Montana, and hello, world. This is Chris Hislop, the Executive Director of the Montana World Affairs Council, and this is Connect Montana, where we bring the world to Montana and Montana to the world. Before introducing our Stockman Bank and Allegiance, we're pleased to welcome Secretary Chuck Hagel, the 24th Secretary of Defense, serving from 2013 to 2015. He's the only Vietnam veteran and the first enlisted combat veteran to serve as Secretary of Defense. Secretary Hagel served 2 terms in the United States Senate, from 1997 to 2009, representing the state of Nebraska. Mr. Hagel was a senior member and chair of several Senate subcommittees. He also served as the chairman of the Congressional Executive Commission on China and the Senate Climate Change Observer Group. Prior to his election to the U.S. Senate, Mr. Hagel was president of McCarthy and Company. He also co-founded Vanguard Cellular Systems Incorporated. He served as a distinguished professor at Georgetown University and chairman of the Atlantic Council. He's the author of the book, America, Our Next Chapter, and was subject of a 2018 book by General Daniel Bolger entitled Our Year of War, and a 2006 book by Charlene Behrens entitled Chuck Hagel, Moving Forward. Secretary Hagel currently serves on a number of boards in the private sector, academia, and public affairs. He's a graduate of the University of Nebraska at Omaha. Secretary Hagel and his wife, Lilibet, have a daughter, Ellen, and son, Ziller. Welcome very much, Secretary Hagel. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. How are you?
I'm well, sir, and thank you for the privilege of exchanging some thoughts with your members in Montana. The only difference between Montana and Nebraska is you have mountains, and a couple of other things, and better trout fishing. But other than that, we're all about the same, really. I've always enjoyed your elected representatives that you send to Washington, your senators and members of the House. Always had great relationships with them and appreciated everything that they do for Montana in the country. Well, what I think I'll do, and really based on what you wanted from me tonight, is talk about global leadership, some of the challenges, I think some of the realities that this country is facing today, the world is facing today. And then we'll use most of the time for question and answers, if that's okay. And again, thank you for allowing me some time tonight. I've always greatly admired what World Affairs Councils do all over this country, because they really do bring, as you say, the world to Montana and Nebraska and California and all over. I'm not sure I can fulfill that charter tonight, but I'll try. But I do, again, congratulate you all for supporting a tremendous institution in the World Affairs Council of Montana. Well, first of all, I've always believed that world leadership depends on 2 things. One is the confidence and the trust of allies, of partners around the world, and also the confidence that adversaries have in our word and our commitment. That's the first requisite, I think, of world leadership, global leadership. But even more important than that is domestic support. The strength of your economy and the purpose of your foreign policy, the purpose behind your strategic interest in the world. And if any of those 2 requisites are flawed or are weak or are in question, then the question of America's global leadership is in question. And I think today, as we look at the beginning of a new year, 2021, I think that's the case. I think that's what we find today in the world. Our leadership is questioned. uh, for the very reasons that I just mentioned, that you have to connect with the two requisites. Um, and both have been fraying, certainly at the edges over the last few years. But now it's becoming obvious, and it's becoming a real challenge. So that's where I start when I talk about world leadership for the United States. We, after World War II, along with our allies, built a liberal world order, a new world order. Nothing like what we built after World War II had ever been tried. We had the League of Nations, but that wasn't the same. So we built the United Nations. We built what I refer to as coalitions of common interest, collective security like NATO, the IMF, the World Bank, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which is now the WTO, and dozens of multilateral institutions and banks to develop nations around the world. Because the theory of all of this was, and what drove all of this, was common interest, the common interest of all peoples. Common interest starting with the environment. We all need clean air to breathe. We need clean water to drink. We need food. We need the basics. We all, no matter how rich your country is or how poor your country is. And we found out through the first 50 years of the 20th century, which were the bloodiest 50 years in the history of man, that we had to do something different. Because now, especially with the advent of nuclear weapons, we were right on the verge of another chapter in disaster if we didn't do something different. And we did do something different. And we created this order that's lasted for basically 70 years. And with all its flaws, it's all its problems and all its challenges, the world is much better off, in my opinion, because we had that world order. More people are free. More people have their own sovereign, independent governance. More people are successful economically, education-wise. We have done an awful lot in the world. We, the United States, leading, as only we could do, with all our partners and even our adversaries, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, for example, all belong to the United Nations, all participate in many of these global institutions. So it wasn't a matter of creating a world and a world order and these institutions because we all agreed on the same things. No, just the opposite. We created them for a common interest of all mankind, but also forums so that we could, rather than sending armies against each other's borders and going back to war, we could try to resolve differences within forums of dignity, of respect, of, yes, common interest, which led to all these different global forums that I mentioned. And that's worked pretty well. No World War III. I think in many ways we take that for granted today. I think much of the world does. But every world leader from World War II went to their graves after World War II worried about a World War III. No nuclear exchange. Every leader went to their graves worried about a nuclear exchange between the Soviet Union and the United States. Now, it doesn't mean it can't happen, but we've been smart. We've been wise in how the United States has led the world. Not dictated to the world, not dominated the world in ways that you do what we say or else. No, just the opposite. We were inclusive. We built systems where we respected the opinions of other countries, like what democracy should be about. You may have Democrats, Republicans, independents, conservatives, liberals. They all have their point of view, and that's the way it should be. And they fight for it the way it should be. But in the end, you've got to compromise. In the end, you've got to make it work. Not for your party, not for your president, but for the country, for the good of the citizens. It's the same thing in world leadership. That's the way you must do it. And I think because when you look at our domestic situation today, that's been developing over the last few years, because we are so politically polarized. We're as politically polarized in this country since, I believe, the Civil War. Now, I wasn't around in those days, but I do read a little history. I think the last time we've seen any polarization in this country, even similar to what we've been going through the last few years, and especially culminating in what happened in the nation's capital on January 6th, and what continues to happen, is probably 1968. And that book that you referenced, that General Bolger wrote, it was about the year 1968. And the reason that I'm in that book, my brother and I, one of my brothers and I served in Vietnam in 1968. That was the worst year for America in Vietnam. We sent over 16,000 dead Americans home in 1 year. I mean, that's hard to believe today. The United States would never stand for that today. But in 1968, many of you will recall, was a terrible year in the United States. We had 2 assassinations, Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King. We had the Chicago riots as a result of the Democratic Convention. Cities burned, Washington burned, LA burned. The polarization and divide and hatred in the streets was really something. And what we've seen over the last few years is even deeper and wider, I think, because it's affected more people. And we've let our politics get to a point, it's almost like a religion. I'm right all the time. You're wrong all the time. So I don't need to talk to you because you're anti-American. You don't care about our country because you disagree with me. Well, that's what we've come to. I mean, any poll shows you that. And I mean, just the fact that a big percentage of people in this country still believe that our election was fraudulent, that it was stolen, when the facts just don't merit. The facts just don't merit a lot of these charges. But the point is, if you are divided in your own country and weakened in your own country and don't have a focus on a foreign policy, and there's no purpose to your power, then you can't lead the world. The world knows this. I mean, the world is interconnected through communications, through everything, like we've never seen before. So nothing happens in this country or in any corner of the world that the rest of the world doesn't know about. So you're not going to hide this. You're not going to kid anybody. Plus, nations from around the world have an ambassador in Washington. And they don't send their second-rate people here. They send their best people. And they know what's going on. They're very smart. And they report back to the United States is in a mess. Then we add to that a global pandemic, which is affecting everybody. The consequences of that, which has affected certainly our economy and every economy around the world, and you all know it. There's nobody that's escaped it. We're still in it and trying to work our way out of it. And I'm going to stay away from politics because I know that's what we want to do, and you all do that. But quite frankly, we've had a president for the last 4 years that has gone to the United Nations General Assembly as each president goes each year and speaks. And each year of his 4 years, he has announced and defined America's foreign policy as America first. The rest of you are freeloaders. NATO's members are not paying enough. Where we have all of our bases, you're not paying enough. You've been living off the United States. We had a situation where that administration tariffed our partners and sanctioned our partners and allies. Well, that adds to it as well. So my main point is we're in a lot of trouble for those reasons and more. Now, what do we do about it? What can we do about it? Because the world is fraying at edges and internally in democracies that we haven't seen before. I mean, look at Western democracies in Europe, what's happening in Poland, what's happening in Hungary. You're seeing democratic elected officials, democracies, move more and more authoritarian, more and more power for the presidents. Certainly, Putin did that and has been doing that for 20 years. We've got a major NATO partner in Turkey that joined NATO in 1952 that we couldn't rely on, and they don't trust us. They have purchased Russian radar systems and Russian equipment to try to interact with the US and NATO equipment. That's put the Turks off to the side. I mean, they're really only a member of NATO in name only. You've got the UK, the United Kingdom, has broken from the European Union, and that's affecting everything. I mean, they'll have consequences for this for years and years. Their trade, everything that goes into relationships. Every democracy in Europe is in some trouble. The ultra right in Germany, the neo-Nazis starting to emerge. Italy's in trouble. France is in trouble. So the point is, as we look around the globe, it isn't just the United States that's so politically polarized and has real internal issues, which threaten, by the way, internal issues are more threatening and more serious than external threats to this country, and always has been. But you see external threats now emerging in ways when our allies are weakened, our allies and partners are weaker. And you see one nation starting to emerge, as it has done over the last few years, as the one great dominant emerging power in the world, and that's, of course, China. The Soviet Union was an economic midget. The Soviet Union was never an economic threat to the United States. It was a military threat, as much for their nuclear capability as anything else. But now you've got a nation in China that has all the pieces: the economy, the military, the nuclear, the size, the capability, the capacity, the education system, and not at all what the Soviet Union had. And that becomes a dominant factor now in global affairs. When I talk with former secretaries of defense, foreign ministers all over the world, and current prime ministers, ambassadors, always the China piece comes up. Well, you don't, Mr. United States, you don't live in Asia. You live 5,000 miles away. We live next to China. We live right there. We have to accommodate China in some way. And we can't rely on you. We don't know what you're going to do because you said we're freeloaders. So we just, for example, signed a new agreement with South Korea yesterday for our basing rights, and they will increase the amount of money that they paid to help house our soldiers there on their land. Okinawa, Japan, we're probably going to do something similar. But all of our relationships with these allies and partners, where we have these military facilities, for example, that are essential to our projection of power, because without allies, without their bases, we couldn't project power, not the way we do. Now, recognizing that those are still important, but some are becoming less important because of sophistication of weapons, because of satellites, because of drones, because a whole new generation of sophisticated weaponry is threatening us and the world. So it's more important, in my opinion, today than ever before, that we reassert our role in the world of global leadership with our partners, with our allies. And I think this president has made that very clear, that that's what he wants to do, and he intends to do it. He talked about it during the campaign, because without that, this country will be in real trouble. We survived for 150 years, probably a little more than that, as much as anything, because we had two vast oceans on the east and the west that protected us. And on our northern and southern borders, we had pretty good partners, not always with Mexico, obviously, but with Canada, a pretty easy relationship because the Canadians are basically, and you know all about that, living in Montana, they're like Americans. And so we were very fortunate in our geography because our geography gave us advantages that most countries don't have. We were fortunate for other reasons too. So when you see the world becoming closer and closer together, 8 billion people, demographers tell us we're going to put probably 2 billion more people on the face of the earth, and we're not doing a particularly good job now on getting along. What the hell is going to happen when we put 2 billion more people? What about the environment? You understand the environment in Montana. It's real. I mean, the science is telling us something. I don't have to recite what's been going on in this country just the last few months. What's just happened in Texas and some of the southern states. Never seen it before. Fires in California all over. Rainfalls, hurricanes, severity. All of that plays a part. The Defense Department is having to deal with this in big ways because we're having to factor in the rising of sea levels with our bases. And if those sea levels continue to rise as they have been rising, not just people thinking that they may rise, but they have been rising, we're having to change our thinking in many, many ways. The Arctic melting, the glaciers melting, Antarctic. So that is a global issue that's not going to get fixed by just the United States, but it's going to have to be all of us. Pandemic health. This COVID challenge isn't, I suspect, be the last one. Our medical people tell you, no, once we get through it, and we will, and we're making progress in that area, we've got to be ready for the next one. Because the more people you put on the face of the earth, the more poverty and the more damage you do to our environment breeds more poverty, more hunger, and more devastation in areas where you don't want devastation, and you don't want forests to be wiped out. So all of these issues now are, I think, as serious and as defined as they've been in a long time. And that leads me to my last point. I do think that we are living at a very defining time. In any way you want to measure that, we are living at one of those defining times in history. And I think historians are going to record that. And I think historians are going to record especially how the United States reacted to all that and how then we decided what we were going to do. Were we going to reassert ourselves as the global leader, not the global dictator, but the global leader? And if we don't, all I can tell you is for my children and my grandchildren, I don't want to see them grow up in a world where the United States is not leading, because like nature, leadership at any level abhors a vacuum. Somebody will fill the vacuum, and that somebody will be China. And I doubt if China will be near as benevolent with its power and generous with its riches as the United States has been, even though we've made plenty of mistakes, and we'll make more. But when you compare the United States global leadership dominance in the world since World War II to any country in history, there's no comparison. What the United States helped others do and what we have done. And in our own interest, if nothing else, we need to continue that. So be glad to respond to anything you want to talk about.
Secretary Hagel, thank you so much for those comments. I mean, you're very uniquely positioned to help us understand better what is happening now and what is happening in the future, and particularly not just what's happening, but really how does it affect us? Now, before going ahead, I just want to remind the audience of a couple things very quickly. We have about 30 more minutes with Secretary Hagel. You're welcome to chat in questions that are relevant to the topic, please, to me, and I'll curate those questions and we'll have a good Q&A session over the next period. My colleague, Julie Heaton, is in touch with all of you. If you would like to be on a mailing list after this event to get a little more information, this is not our big main mailing list, just the list post-event, please let her know. So one thing that has happened here, Secretary Hagel, in every of our previous 60 shows is we've never had enough time to answer all of the questions, but I'd like to kick things off. First of all, you had a very interesting article on the 19th of January in Defense One. It's called Advice to the Next Secretary of Defense. And if I'm not mistaken, that was prior to Secretary Austin's confirmation. But one point really stood out for me. You wrote in that article, we can and we do self-correct, meaning the United States of America, we can and we do self-correct. Now, in your remarks, you mentioned, a number of things that may not be going so well, some fraying alliances, some relationships that might need a little extra help. Can you tell us, in terms of global leadership, are we self-correcting now? And if so, to what end are we self-correcting?
Well, thank you. I did mention that in that op-ed that Defense One wanted me to write, because I think that is very much the essence of who we are, who our democracy is, why we have the Constitution, why we are a nation of laws, because we have the capability, the capacity to self-correct. I mean, for example, we have 27 amendments to the Constitution. Well, we have 27 amendments to the Constitution because we didn't get it all right the first time. And the world is changing. It's like nature. Tomorrow is tomorrow. Tomorrow will be different from today. The challenges change. Institutions change. They have to stay relevant to the challenges and opportunities that you have. So yes, has been as big a part of who we are and our success, I think, over almost 250 years as anything, our ability to self-correct. So you apply that to your point, to your question, to foreign policy. We've done it in foreign policy. I mentioned China is the emerging power. People predicted that China would be a major power 25 years ago, and so on. People make predictions based on what things look like at the time and so on. Some of them work out, some of them don't. And as you project out on foreign policy, especially for us, but any nation's foreign policy has to focus on the nation's self-interests. What are America's self-interests? Now, self-interest don't mean that you are divorced from the self-interest of other nations. Not at all. Not at all. As I mentioned, common interests were what really was the basis of the new world order that we built right after World War II. So you're self-correcting your foreign policy as well, because things change. The Middle East is probably as messy and volatile and dangerous as we've ever seen it. I don't know of a time when it was more dangerous than it is right now. I mean, you've got ungovernable countries that really are not countries by border. That's all. They have non-functioning governments. And you still got militias and wars going on in most of those countries. That's an example of how things change, how you self-correct your foreign policy. By the way, allies. I mean, there's not a better example than Germany and Japan after World War II, our two worst enemies during World War II. Very soon after World War II, they became two of our most critical allies, and are to this day. Your foreign policy shifted. You have to self-correct. You have to see the realities of what's happening and what you think may happen, where the currents are going, the relationships of other countries to each other. For example, I mean, China, again, can be used as a clear example of that, where they take advantage of us all the time, where they can. Uh, President Trump pulling the United States out of the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I think it was a huge mistake, if for no other reason than it opened the door for China to say to these 11 other countries, and they did. I was told that by all the leaders of those countries. China opens the door by saying, if the United States doesn't care about you, I do. China does. We'll trade with you. We'll make a good deal for you. You live right here. You should be a friend of China anyway, a partner of China anyway. Well, of course, what they don't tell you is the deals in the background that they never will tell you about. But that's an example. So yes, self-correction in foreign policy is an essential piece of diplomacy.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. One other thing, just to let you know and our audience know, is that we're welcoming a cohort of high school teachers coming to us via the National Consortium for Teaching About Asia. The NCTA is a multi-year initiative to encourage and facilitate teaching and learning about East Asia in elementary and secondary schools worldwide. So we're getting a lot of questions coming in, including from these teachers. Here's one for you. Turning to Asia, it is an increasingly dangerous neighborhood where one small mistake can have a heavy impact. How do you characterize U.S.-China relations? And do we have the kind of relationship with Beijing that can reduce tensions, for example, in Taiwan, if and when they emerge?
Well, thanks for the question, and greetings to all the teachers. And teachers, in my opinion, and have been over the years, are the real heroes of every generation. I admire teachers greatly, and I know it's more and more difficult to teach for a lot of reasons these days, but thank you for what you do. It means a lot, and your contributions are immense, and they're going to continue to grow, so thank you. As to the question, our relations are not good with China, obviously. I think that's partly our fault. I think we've let those relations fray. One of the things I learned about China a long time ago, when I started a cellular telephone company back in the early 80s, after I left the Reagan administration as being the number 2 at the VA, I started this company with a couple of partners. And in those days, like 82, 83, nobody knew what cellular was. They thought it was some medical term. But I used to describe it as very simple. It's wireless telephony. That's simple. So I started an international company. And one of the places we went, I think the first out of the United States country we went to was China, for obvious reasons. I mean, they had no infrastructure for telecommunications, poor country, huge country. And what cellular telephony, wireless telephony could do for those countries was amazing, with no infrastructure costs and so on. So I took a senior engineer from Motorola with me, and 2 of my engineers with me. The reason I took Motorola is because Motorola was the only American company in those days that was making cellular telephones. And many of you will recall the size of a cellular telephone in those days was the size of a shoe, a men's size 12, by the way. And so we went and spent about 2.5 weeks in China. I was on one of the first flights that went from New York to Beijing on Pan Am, or not Pan Am, but United, once a week. New York to Beijing, once a week, Beijing back to New York. And so what I learned was so much in those 2.5 weeks of China, in China. We were in Tianjin, Shanghai, Beijing, and I was one day, we were talking to a large group of Chinese engineers. There were about 100 of them. They were all very smart, and they would take notes on everything. And after the session was over, the Chinese engineer walked me out. And I said, well, thank you for giving us an opportunity to talk to all of your people. And he said, no, he said, we learned a lot. But he said, I would give you some advice, Mr. Hagel. He said, China is a country 5,000 years old. And we are very patient. And we do things our way. And it's always patience. But we get them done the Chinese way. I've never, ever forgotten that, because you can apply that to everything. And so when you ask about Taiwan and our relationship with China now, our diplomatic relationship, it's not good. And everybody knows that. If you read the paper, you know that. When I was Secretary of Defense, I was in China twice. I met with President Xi both times and had some very tough talks. But one of the things the Chinese respect is clear, direct talk. And the other thing that they respect is strength. You don't have to threaten them, but they know if you're strong or not. They know what you're saying, if it's believable or not. But be direct and honest with it. Now they won't agree, and they'll make it difficult, and so on. But one of the reasons I had to go see Xi was because of what the Chinese were doing in the East China Sea and South China Sea, building up those little pieces of rock into islands that were all contested. The Vietnamese, the Philippines, Japan, others said, no, we own those areas. And the Chinese said, no, our 9-dash line says we own them. And they lied about why they were building up. They were building them up for military reasons, for runways and ports for their ships. That's what it was. So my conversations with Xi were not pleasant. But that had to be because I was not the diplomat. I was the Secretary of Defense. John Kerry took a different approach, as he had to take a different approach. On Taiwan, because our relationship with China has devolved and we lost influence with China, it's more difficult to deal with the Chinese now on issues like Taiwan. So one of the things that we have been able to do, and I foresee us continuing to do this, is keep a strong presence in that area, and let the Chinese know that we support, yes, a two-China policy, but we support Taiwanese too, and we're going to continue to support them. Now, my guess is that the way the Chinese operate, and Xi in particular, who probably has consolidated more power than any Chinese leader since Mao, they'll test us on that. They'll test us on Taiwan. What do you mean that you're still supporting Taiwan? And they'll test us in different ways, but they will test us. And that's why it's important to keep diplomatic channels open, to keep your diplomatic efforts always open and moving in some direction, because you're always going to need them. Because we can't let a relationship like China with China just completely go to hell. I mean, that would be far too dangerous for the world and for us. That just can't happen. So you've got to balance this, your interest, your policy. Partly is you must stay strong. The Chinese must know you're strong. They must have, they believe your word, and have confidence in your credibility. And that's where you start. But the Taiwan issue is going to be a tricky issue, I think.
Thank you, Secretary Hagel. A lot of questions coming in now, so I'm gonna meld a few of them together and pitch this one to you. There's a number of questions asking you about your opinion on priorities, U.S. foreign policy priorities. So could I ask you this? Could you share with us two key U.S. foreign policy priorities, but a third, which maybe we don't hear a lot about in the media? Maybe it's not up on everybody's radar, but it's there and it's important.
Well, I think first, and I think President Biden is moving in this direction, and he announced it early on, to reaffirm and strengthen our alliances and our allies, because we can't go this alone. We can't deal with China alone. Or quite frankly, the Iranians or the North Koreans or Russia. So you want strong allies and alliances with you so that you're speaking with a magnified force. It's just not the United States, but it's Europe and so on and so on. It's Japan and South Korea, whatever. So to reaffirm those alliances and strengthen those alliances, I think is the first thing. I think obviously China is right at the top as well, because China represents, the relationship with China represents every facet of our country and our interests, certainly economically. My farmers in Nebraska, just like Montana and ranchers, exports, huge. That relationship is huge. So every aspect of our economy is touched by our relationship with China. Certainly security, certainly military, certainly intelligence gathering and sharing with our neighbors and not our neighbors, but our partners in Asia, to keep the closeness of those relationships with partners, to trade intelligence, to share intelligence, know what's going on, what the Chinese are doing. The strength that China has in all the capacities that I referred to early on means that we have to deal with them. So I would put that right at the top as well. As to your third part of the question, maybe there's something we're not paying attention to. I've always believed that cyber, the threat of cyber, is as dominant and immediate and long-term as any threat there is. Nuclear is a threat, yes, and we've got to get back to moving in some directions with new non-nuclear proliferation treaties. We've let them die. We've just gotten out of them. It's too damn dangerous now because you've got North Korea, you've got Iran. It isn't like you could just, you and the Soviet Union, and the French would do what we say, Israel would do what we say, UK, different world now. Pakistan's got them, India's got them, nine countries have them. And so I would say cyber, that quiet, insidious threat that can paralyze a country. You don't know where it's coming from. You don't know when it's coming. You don't have good intelligence on it. The power of cyber is unbelievable. And I think we've seen very clearly just the last few years on what it can do. And again, I would put nuclear in there as well. But cyber, the larger context of cyber, obviously the Middle East is a problem. Afghanistan's a problem. They've been ongoing problems, but I wouldn't rate them as high as the threats that we're going to have to pay attention to and the challenges that I just mentioned.
Well, Secretary Hagel, here in Montana, as you say, we're acutely aware of the relationship with China. The China trade deal, for one, as you probably know, next to Canada, China is the largest trade partner for Montana's exports, primarily agriculture, our grain and beef and so on. So a lot of people here watch it very closely. Thanks a lot for your remarks. And I'm just going to follow up then from another fellow Montanan here.
May I?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. May I add just one thing when you
Please.
mentioned the trade and with China? Your former senator, who was our ambassador to China, Max Baucus, who I worked with a lot in the Senate, and he did a great job in China, worked with a lot in China as well when I was Secretary of Defense, deserves a lot of credit. I think you Montanans know that, but I just wanted to tell you this is coming from a Nebraskan who doesn't often give you credit, but he deserves a lot of credit.
Well, thanks a lot for that. Senator Baucus is a good friend here of our organization and of our state, and definitely is a strong voice on foreign policy in general, but on Asian policy and particularly in China. Here's another question, again on China. I mean, you've kind of laid out some of the problems here and possible ways of looking at them. Question is, what are the possible levers, angles, or building blocks for leading our nation toward a better relationship with China?
Well, I'm not sure that I could add much to what I've already talked about. I mean, the building blocks have to be, I think, of common interest to both countries. Certainly trade. Certainly the Chinese want to trade with us more. They'd like to get more of their products into this country. They have over the years been doing a very good job of that, getting them. But in Europe, they want more products in this country, in their countries. I mean, so I think trade and the economy are very, very big building blocks that you can build upon. Then I think what we've seen pretty effectively work over the years, the last 20 years, are educational exchanges. The Chinese like that. How many Chinese students were getting educated in the United States? Now, I know a lot of people say, yeah, but they're just here to understand how to steal our secrets, and they get to know us, so they go back to China and take advantage of that education. Well, I don't see it that way. Is some of that going on? Yes. It's not the way I see it. I think that there's tremendous value in those exchange programs in education to education. We also have common interest in Asia. I mean, the fact is, the United States has always been a Pacific power, always. And we're going to continue to have interests there and be a Pacific power. We can cooperate with China in some ways. Space. China is doing very well in space as we are reestablishing and reasserting our position in space and putting more and more resources in it. I think there's an area that we could find some real common ground, as we did with the Soviets and continue to do with the Russians. So I think, again, and also the environment, and I would say pandemics, but particularly the environment. China has been doing quite a bit on the environment. I remember when I led the congressional delegation to Kyoto, the first United Nations environmental conference, and that was 1997, I think. One of the senators that was on the delegation was a senior senator by the name of John Chafee. And John Chafee was from Rhode Island. He'd been governor of Rhode Island. He was a World War II veteran and had been in China during World War II. So we had a couple of days, 3 days, we got there early before everything started. So he said, why don't we go into China? And I said, it's a good idea. So we got a US military plane. And it was the first time the Chinese had allowed a US military plane to go beyond Beijing in China. And we went to Chengdu, Sichuan province, where the pandas come from. But what we saw the Chinese doing in 1997 in Chengdu province was amazing with environmental work. And they have done very well on working on their environment. Not in all the areas. A lot of the areas are in terrible shape, especially way west China. But they've become one of the leaders on the environment. So those kind of issues where we've got common interests, they're big global issues. It's good for both of us. I think that's where you start. Like any relationship, you don't start with your differences. You start with your common interests. You get to your differences, but you have to use your common interests, building some trust and building forums and platforms to, let's take this issue on. I know we don't agree here, but why don't we address this issue? That's the way it's done. And it's not complicated. It's the way it's done in business or the way people get along in communities. We don't all agree with each other in communities, but you got to live in the community together, make the community good, make it better than before. So same thing.
Thanks a lot for that, Secretary Hagel. More questions than we're going to have time for. But I just wanted to point out, I appreciate your point on the exchange programs. As you probably know, here at the University of Montana in Missoula, we have the Marine and Mike Mansfield Center, which is an incredible resource for the entire state, particularly on Asian studies, but also on exchanges. And we get a lot of students exchanged, Americans to Asia, Asians here to Montana. So that's just a shout out to our friends there. Another question here. What can the random American citizen do to make it easier for our designated Cognizant officials to move the U.S. to a stronger position of effective international leadership?
Well, by the way, Mike Mansfield, I first met Mike Mansfield when he was ambassador to Japan. And I was president of the World USO, and we had big USOs in Japan, all over Japan, Okinawa. And he was terrific. All your leaders, as I said earlier, John Tester, I served with for a while in the Senate. A couple of years before I left the Senate. I don't know your other senator, but I know who he is. And you've always sent really, really strong, capable, good people to Washington. Well, I think again, I'm not sure I'd break any new ground in how I'd answer that. I think it's you've got to use all the dynamics, facilities, and opportunities you find to try to enhance, encourage, build relationships, and develop influence. But you also use challenges too. China is not this impenetrable giant that strides across the globe. They've got a lot of problems. And we've got problems. So where you can match those problems up and where you can cooperate, rather than trying to take advantage of each other's problems, which we do. The United States does as much as any country. Also use those problems to maybe find new common ground of influence and relationship building as well. It'll never be perfect. I mean, somebody once said, for a president of the United States and foreign policy, there's never a good option. I think Jim Baker once said that. I mean, in foreign policy, there's never a good option because foreign policy is ruled by reality. It's ruled by reality. And you only have so much influence on that. You can only do so much with that reality. And you try to do as much as you can to control it and to influence it and bring it around to your policies favorable to you. But you're dealing with the uncontrollable all the time.
Well, maybe we could use that to pivot to another global problem, which is Syria, of course. Now, you mentioned the role of Turkey and NATO and so on, a key player in the Syrian conflict. Could you share with us kind of your views on the current policy towards Syria, and what do you think President Biden's policy might be able to do there?
Well, I'm not sure we have a policy on Syria. Quite frankly, when I was Secretary of Defense in the second Obama administration, I mean, I don't think we ever came up with a policy then. I don't think Trump ever had a policy. I think Biden is reassessing his Middle East policy. I think as he should do, that will include Syria, but you can't deal with those countries on a singular basis of this is our Syria policy, then we'll have a Saudi policy, then we'll have a Yemen policy. It didn't work that way. You've got to come at it, especially the Middle East, to have a regional policy. Yes, each of those countries is part of the region, and you deal with it with a separate strip, but you've got to have a regional wide policy. When are you going to send troops? When not send troops? So on and so on and so on. And I think if we have any policy, it's just to extricate ourselves from Syria. But the problem with that is, and as you know, we've got probably 1,000 troops in Western Syria to help the rebels and our Kurdish allies, which has put us at odds with the Turks, and be intelligence sources. But I don't think we've got a policy. And I think Biden's going to have to come up with a policy, but it will be informed and coordinated with a larger Middle East policy that I know his people are working on now.
Secretary, we have time for one last question. I think we've talked a lot about the realpolitik of military and economic and trade affairs. Here's a question from one of our participants. It's focused on China, but feel free to broaden this. How can the U.S. deal with human rights issues and continue to maintain its global leadership?
Yeah, well, good question. It's a question that's put to every president, every secretary of state, every policymakers. Are we a nation that respects, admires, and supports human rights or not? And so human rights, just like any value that the United States espouses, that we say that we stand for, and that we will fight for, is always tempered with the reality of allies versus adversaries. I think Saudi Arabia is a very clear example of what's happened in the last 2 weeks with the Khashoggi thing. Well, we're not going to sanction the Crown Prince, MBS, because Saudi Arabia represents an important strategic partner of ours. And yes, our intelligence community said that he gave the order and he did it all, but we kind of have to wink and overlook that because of the bigger interest that we have. And that's the way the Biden administration has approached it. I think that's wrong. I think you've got to be consistent. I think you've got to treat our allies, our leaders, not Saudi Arabia. That's different. But the leader of Saudi Arabia, the Crown Prince, has to be dealt with, I think, the same way that any other adversary or any adversary would be dealt with. You can't pick and choose. Well, we're not quite supportive of human rights here because they're an ally, but we are here. China, what you're doing is terrible to Uyghurs and so on, and so on. And so you have to thread that. I think the United States should have sanctioned MBS and could have done more, should have done more. And I think it will come back to bite us. I don't think it's in our interest. When I talked earlier in the program about reestablishing credibility and trust in our leadership and who we are, and not just what we say, because this is a matter of not just what we say, but it's what we do. And in this case, I think we failed on the human rights side. And I think for the long term, huge mistake. And I think it will cost us.
Well, thank you for that, Secretary Hagel. And thank you so much again for coming on to our show. I think that when we have public servants like yourself who have a long career, supporting America and the American people, but staying active on these issues, coming and talking to us, giving us your perspective, we benefit hugely. So I want to say thank you to you very sincerely. Now, before I wrap up, we have just a couple minutes. Any last words back to you, sir?
First of all, thank you, and thanks the council and all your members for giving me a little time. I appreciate it very much. And I've told you what I think of World Affairs Councils. It's so valuable, it's very valuable for a state, for a community. No, I would just say this. One last thing. I said this in a speech I made, I think a couple of weeks ago. Power without purpose always ends up badly. And that incorporates everything that we've talked about. The last question about human rights. That power has to have something behind it. It has to have a purpose. It has to stand for something. Human rights, dignity for all people, respecting all people, all religions. and dealing with on the other side of reality, tyrants and dictators and what they do, and how they decimate human rights and no respect for anybody. And I think that's something the United States has to keep in mind all the time. We can't conduct foreign policy only on human rights, if that's the one thing. That is a one thing. It's an important thing because that's who we are. It's who we say we are. It's who over the years, what we believed, haven't always followed through with it. But if that's who you say you are, and that's who you believe you are, that's a purpose. And all of the world has to understand that. And that has to be incorporated in our policy.
Well, thank you very much for that, Secretary Hagel. And again, thank you for joining us. Let me just have a few points of wrap up. It's 7 o'clock now. So many thanks again to the audience and to our very generous sponsors, the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation, Stockman Bank, and Allegiance. And special thanks to Secretary Hagel. If you like this kind of thing, please join us Tuesday evenings, 6 to 7 o'clock and Mountain Time, using the same link that you used today. And if you missed any of our previous 60 shows, go to our YouTube channel and check it out. And if you really like international affairs and want to stay in touch, check us out at montanaworldaffairs.org on the web. Get on our mailing list, join our events, and support us with a donation. Why not? Next Tuesday, March 16th, we have author and academic Yuli Tamir. She's joining us to talk about nationalism, a very important and key point, certainly was a subtext to several of the issues today. She makes an argument for a very different kind of nationalism, one that revives its participatory, creative, and egalitarian virtue and is essential to democracy at its best. That's next Tuesday, March 16th at 12 noon, not 6 p.m., in order to accommodate her time zone. So please join us next Tuesday at noon. Until then, thank you again, Mr. Secretary. Much appreciated. Thank you to the audience. Be well and goodbye.